The story of why Joseph Stalin celebrated two different birthdays is not merely a curious biographical footnote, but a window into the mechanics of totalitarian power, the deliberate construction of political mythology, and the psychology of a man who understood that controlling the narrative of one's own life was inseparable from controlling the destiny of millions. On the surface, the question seems simple enough. Every Soviet citizen knew that their leader's birthday fell on December 21st, 1879. This date had been canonized in 1929 when the entire country celebrated Stalin's 50th birthday with the orchestrated enthusiasm that would become characteristic of the cult of personality. 10 years later, in 1939, the 60th anniversary passed without formal state celebration. Though newspapers dutifully filled their columns with congratulations and praise, a muted acknowledgement during a period when Stalin was consolidating power through terror and preparing the Soviet Union for the coming global conflagration. But it was 1949 that marked the apotheosis of Stalin's birthday celebrations, a spectacle of sycophancy and state power that transformed December 21st into a quasi-religious holiday. The 70th birthday festivities included lavish gifts from across the Soviet Empire and beyond, foreign delegations arriving in Moscow to pay tribute, a gala meeting at the Bolshoi Theater, where the greatest performers of the age sang praises to the living deity, and a cascade of honors that reflected not merely Stalin's vanity, but the complete subordination of Soviet society to his will. Yet, beneath this carefully constructed edifice of certainty lay a troubling discrepancy. In 1925, the newspaper Izvestia published a report that sent ripples through those few who paid attention to such details. According to the metric book of the Assumption Church in the Georgian town of Gori, the peasant Vissarion Ivanovich Jugashvili and his wife Ekaterina Gavrilovna had registered the birth of their son Yosef on December 6, 1878, according to the old-style calendar then in use throughout the Russian Empire. Converted to the new-style Gregorian calendar, this would be December 18, 1878. The discrepancy was not merely a matter of days, but of an entire year and 3 days, separating the official birthday from the baptismal record. This was not an isolated document. The same date, December 6, 1878, appeared in Yosef Jugashvili's graduation certificate from the Gori Theological College, the institution where the young Stalin received his formative education before abandoning religious studies for revolutionary politics. The date surfaced again in an 1811 notice from the St. Petersburg Governor's Gendarmerie Department, part of the vast surveillance apparatus that tracked political dissidents across the Russian Empire. These were not casual mentions, but official records created by different institutions at different times, all independently confirming the same birth date that contradicted the later official version. Even more remarkably, in 1920, Stalin himself provided the earlier date. When the Swedish newspaper Folkets Dagblad Politiken sent him a questionnaire, Stalin personally filled it out, recording his birth year as 1878. This was not a clerical error or a document prepared by subordinates. Stalin's own hand confirmed the date that would later be officially erased. The year 1920 is significant here. By this point, Stalin was already a member of the Politburo, one of the most powerful men in the newly established Soviet state. He had survived the brutal years of revolution and civil war, had proven himself an effective organizer and ruthless enforcer of Bolshevik power. He was not a fugitive filling out false documents to evade the Tsarist police, but a senior leader of a victorious revolutionary government. The transformation occurred sometime between 1920 and 1922. According to Izvestia's investigation, in 1922, Stalin personally edited biographical information about himself that his secretary Ivan Tovstuka then distributed to Communist Party historians for official reference. These documents were explicitly labeled as biographical information personally reviewed and corrected by Stalin himself, removing any possibility of unauthorized alteration. In these corrected documents, Stalin's birth year appeared as 1879, the date that would become canonical and remain so until his death in 1953 and beyond. From 1921 onward, all party documents listed Stalin as having been born in 1879, a date he used consistently in his official capacity as a delegate and leader. The question that haunts historians is not merely what happened, but why. What motivated a man at the height of his power to alter the historical record of his own birth? The most prosaic explanation suggests that Stalin reduced his age by a year to avoid military conscription during the Russo-Japanese War or World War I. This was indeed a common practice among young men seeking to evade service in the Tsar's armies. However, this explanation collapses under scrutiny. Stalin was an only child, and after his father Vissarion's early death, he remained his mother Ekaterina's sole breadwinner. Under Russian law, this status exempted him from military service regardless of his age. There was no practical reason for Stalin to falsify his birth year to avoid conscription. Moreover, the chronology does not support this theory. When Stalin was arrested in Baku in 1910 as a member of the Russian Social Democratic Workers' Party and exiled to Siberia for 5 years, his official record listed his birth year as 1880, yet another date entirely. This suggests that revolutionary aliases and false documents were indeed part of his clandestine life, but these were temporary expedients of an underground activist, not the deliberate construction of a permanent historical narrative. The practice of using false documents was indeed common among Russian revolutionaries. The Tsarist security apparatus, the Okhrana, was sophisticated and relentless, maintaining detailed files on thousands of political dissidents. Revolutionaries routinely used pseudonyms, altered their ages, changed their places of birth, and moved between identities as circumstances required. Joseph Jugashvili himself used numerous aliases before settling on Stalin, meaning man of steel, a name that perfectly captured the image he wished to project. But these tactical deceptions were abandoned once the revolutionaries seized power. Lenin did not maintain false birth records. Trotsky did not obscure his origins. The other Bolshevik leaders returned to their actual identities once the need for conspiracy had passed. Stalin's case was different. He began to change his birth year consciously and systematically only in the 1920s, when he was already one of the most powerful leaders in the country and faced no threat of prosecution or persecution. This was not a revolutionary evading the secret police, but a member of the ruling elite rewriting his own history. The deliberateness of this act distinguishes it from mere clerical error or bureaucratic confusion. If the discrepancy had been an innocent mistake, why did Stalin write 1878 in the 1920 Swedish newspaper questionnaire and then change it to 1879 in his 1922 biographical notes? A man who personally reviewed and corrected his biographical information was not making careless errors. He was constructing something. One intriguing explanation emerged decades later from an unexpected source. Alexander Berdyansky, Stalin's grandson, gave an interview in 2007 to the Ukrainian publication Gordon's Boulevard, in which he offered a perspective that connected Stalin's biographical manipulation to the world of esoteric philosophy and mysticism. Berdyansky suggested that Stalin had been influenced by the doctrines of Georgy Gurdjieff, the religious mystic and philosopher who developed a complex system of spiritual development that attracted followers across Europe and beyond. According to Gurdjieff's teachings, as Berdyansky understood them, a person should deliberately hide their real origins and shroud even the date of their birth in mystery as part of a process of spiritual self-transformation and liberation from conventional identity. The connection between Stalin and Gurdjieff is tantalizing but frustratingly difficult to verify. Both men studied at the Tbilisi Spiritual Seminary, the institution where young Georgians received education in Orthodox theology and where many future revolutionaries first encountered radical ideas. However, it remains unclear whether their time at the seminary overlapped or whether they ever met. Gurdjieff himself cultivated mystery around his origins, and his exact birth date remains uncertain, with multiple versions circulating among his followers and biographers. The parallel between Stalin's obscured birth date and Gurdjieff's similar biographical ambiguity suggests either a shared cultural practice or, more speculatively, a direct influence. The notion that Stalin, the materialist Marxist-Leninist who would later persecute religion with unprecedented ferocity, might have been influenced by mystical teachings seems paradoxical. Yet Stalin's seminary education exposed him to theological concepts and spiritual disciplines that left traces throughout his life. His rhetorical style, with its catechistic structure of questions and answers, echoed the pedagogical methods of Orthodox instruction. His understanding of ideological orthodoxy and heresy, his insistence on doctrinal purity, and his savage punishment of deviation all bore the marks of religious, rather than purely political thinking. If Stalin absorbed ideas from Gurdjieff or similar mystical thinkers during his formative years, it would not have been the spiritual content that attracted him, but rather the techniques of self-transformation, the idea that identity itself could be deliberately constructed and reconstructed according to will. There is another dimension to consider, one rooted not in mysticism but in the practical politics of cult construction. By the late 1920s, Stalin was engaged in a systematic campaign to eliminate his rivals and establish himself as Lenin's sole legitimate heir. This required not merely political maneuvering but the creation of a mythology that presented Stalin as the inevitable leader, the man whose entire life had prepared him for this role. Every detail of his biography became a weapon in this struggle. His Georgian origins, his humble background, his seminary education, his revolutionary activities, all were carefully curated to construct a narrative of the selfless revolutionary who had dedicated his life to the working class. In this context, changing his birth date served multiple purposes. Making himself slightly younger enhanced the impression of vigor and longevity, suggesting that he would lead the Soviet Union for decades to come. The year 1879 placed his birth at a symbolically significant moment, closer to the revolutionary ferment of the late 19th century. The December 21st date, falling near the winter solstice, carried its own symbolic weight, marking the darkest day of the year from which light returns, a metaphor that Soviet propagandists could exploit. More fundamentally, the very act of changing one's birth date demonstrated total control over historical narrative. If Stalin could rewrite the basic facts of his own existence and compel an entire society to accept this revision, what could he not do? The 1929 50th birthday celebration was the first major test of this revised biography. The entire Soviet propaganda apparatus mobilized to mark the occasion, producing a flood of articles, speeches, poems, and artwork celebrating Stalin's life and achievements. No one publicly questioned the date. No journalist pointed out the discrepancy with church records or earlier documents. The power to control information, to determine what could be said and what must remain silent, had already been established. The purges that would devastate Soviet society in the 1930s were still ahead, but the mechanisms of totalitarian control were already functioning. The birthday celebration demonstrated that historical truth was whatever the party. which meant Stalin, declared it to be. By 1949, when Stalin turned 70 according to the official chronology, the cult of personality had reached its zenith. The celebrations that year were unprecedented in their scale and extravagance. Delegations arrived from every corner of the Soviet Empire and from communist parties worldwide, bearing gifts that ranged from industrial equipment to works of art. The Bolshoi Theater Gala featured performances by the greatest artists of the age, all paying tribute to the leader. Stalin's image was everywhere, his name invoked constantly, his wisdom quoted as scripture. The man who had been born in a modest house in provincial Gori had become a living deity, and the date of his birth had become a sacred moment in the revolutionary calendar. Yet even at this moment of apparent triumph, the falsification at the heart of Stalin's biography remained. The church records in Gori still showed December 6, 1878. The graduation certificate from the theological college had not been destroyed. Stalin's own handwriting in the 1920 questionnaire testified to the earlier date. These documents survived, hidden in archives, waiting for historians who would one day be permitted to examine them. The Soviet system excelled at controlling public discourse, at enforcing ideological conformity, at punishing dissent. But it could not entirely erase the documentary record, the accumulated traces of historical reality that persisted despite official narratives. The question of Stalin's birthday illuminates a larger truth about totalitarian systems and the construction of political authority. In democratic societies, leaders are expected to be transparent about their backgrounds. Discrepancies in biographical details become scandals that can end careers. But in totalitarian regimes, the leader's biography is not a record of facts, but a political tool, a narrative crafted to serve ideological purposes. Stalin understood this instinctively. His decision to alter his birth date was not an act of vanity or deception in the ordinary sense, but a demonstration of power, a declaration that he controlled not merely the present and future, but the past itself. This control over historical narrative extended far beyond Stalin's personal biography. Under his rule, Soviet historians rewrote the history of the revolution, eliminating or diminishing the roles of purged leaders like Trotsky, Bukharin, and Zinoviev. Photographs were altered to remove unpersons who had fallen from favor. Textbooks were constantly revised to reflect current political orthodoxy. The past became fluid, changeable, always conforming to present needs. George Orwell, writing in 1949 as Stalin celebrated his official 70th birthday, captured this phenomenon in his novel 1984, with the party slogan that whoever controls the past controls the future, and whoever controls the present controls the past. Stalin's manipulation of his birth date was a microcosm of this larger project. If the leader could rewrite the basic facts of his own life with impunity, if he could compel an entire society to celebrate a birthday that contradicted documentary evidence, then no historical truth was safe. The implications extended beyond mere propaganda. When citizens cannot trust basic biographical information about their leaders, when official narratives contradict documentary evidence, when questioning such discrepancies becomes dangerous or impossible, then the very concept of objective truth begins to erode. People learn to accept contradictions, to repeat official lies, to suppress their own knowledge of reality. This psychological conditioning was essential to totalitarian rule. The mystery of Stalin's two birthdays also reveals something about the man himself. Despite his image as the confident, all-powerful dictator, Stalin remained deeply insecure about his origins. His Georgian accent when speaking Russian marked him as an outsider among the predominantly Russian and Russified Bolshevik elite. His lack of theoretical sophistication, compared to intellectuals like Lenin and Trotsky, made him sensitive to accusations that he was merely a practical organizer, rather than a true revolutionary thinker. His physical appearance, short and pockmarked from childhood smallpox, failed to match the heroic ideal of revolutionary leadership. These insecurities drove him to construct an idealized version of himself, and altering his birth date was part of this construction. The December 21st date that Stalin chose or accepted as his official birthday became one of the most important dates in the Soviet calendar. Factories organized socialist competitions to mark the occasion with increased production. Schools held special lessons about Stalin's life and achievements. Workers received extra rations. The day became a moment for renewing loyalty oaths and demonstrating enthusiasm for the regime. This ritualization of the leader's birthday was not unique to the Soviet Union, but was characteristic of totalitarian systems generally. Hitler's birthday, Mussolini's birthday, Mao's birthday, all became occasions for mass demonstrations of loyalty and vehicles for political mobilization. After Stalin's death in March 1953, the Soviet leadership began the process of de-Stalinization, dismantling the cult of personality and acknowledging at least some of the crimes committed during his rule. Nikita Khrushchev's secret speech to the 20th Party Congress in 1956 catalogued Stalin's abuses and marked the beginning of a more critical historical assessment. Yet even during this period, the question of Stalin's actual birth date remained largely unexplored in official Soviet historiography. The December 21st, 1879 date continued to appear in reference works and biographies. Only with the gradual opening of archives during the Glasnost period, under Mikhail Gorbachev, in the late 1980s, did historians gain access to the documentary evidence that revealed the discrepancy. The story of Stalin's two birthdays offers lessons that extend beyond Soviet history. It demonstrates how authoritarian leaders construct legitimacy through the manipulation of biographical narrative. It shows how control over information allows regimes to enforce acceptance of obvious falsehoods. It reveals the psychological mechanisms by which populations learn to suppress their knowledge of truth in favor of official lies. These patterns recur across different times and places, from ancient empires to modern dictatorships. The specific details change, but the underlying dynamics remain constant. Leaders who demand absolute power invariably seek to control not merely the present, but the past, reshaping history to justify their rule. In the end, the question of why Stalin had two birthdays cannot be answered with complete certainty. The documentary evidence shows that he was born on December 6, 1878, according to church records and his own early statements. It shows that he deliberately changed this date to December 21st, 1879, sometime around 1922, and that this later date became official Soviet history. The motivations remain partially obscure, perhaps involving elements of mystical influence from figures like Gurdjieff, perhaps serving the practical purposes of cult construction, perhaps reflecting deeper psychological needs to reinvent himself. What is certain is that this biographical manipulation was not a trivial matter, but a revealing example of how totalitarian power operates, how historical truth becomes subordinate to political necessity, and how the control of narrative serves as an instrument of domination. The two birthdays of Joseph Stalin remind us that in systems where power is absolute, even the most basic facts become negotiable, and the past itself becomes a weapon in the hands of those who rule the present.